There's something uniquely quiet about Generation X parents. They weren't loud about their love. They didn't post about it. They didn't always explain it. But it was there often, in ways that only make sense years later. They grew up in a time where independence wasn't optional. It was expected. Many of them learned early that emotions were private, responsibility was personal, and resilience was survival. So, when they became parents, they didn't raise their children with grand speeches, they raised them with space. Space to figure things out, space to fall, space to recover. To some, that space felt distant. To others, it felt like trust. This video isn't about judging Generation X parents. It's about understanding the psychology behind how they loved and why it looked different from what we're used to today. If you grew up with a Gen X parent, or if you are one, this perspective may feel familiar, and maybe a little overdue. Generation X parents were often called the latchkey generation. Many of them came home to empty houses. They learned how to heat their own food, finish homework alone, and solve small problems without asking for help. Not because they were neglected, but because independence was normal. Silence wasn't loneliness, it was routine. They didn't grow up with constant supervision or emotional coaching. They grew up with responsibility. So when they became parents, they didn't hover. They stood nearby. They didn't solve every discomfort. They trusted discomfort to teach. To a child, that can feel like distance. But to a Gen X parent, it often feels like preparation. Preparation for a world that won't always explain itself. And in their minds, strength wasn't something you were told. It was something you discovered. Generation X parents didn't grow up in a culture of emotional expression. They grew up in a culture of emotional control. Feelings weren't ignored, but they weren't always discussed. Vulnerability was private. Struggles were handled internally. Many of them learned that strength meant not breaking down in front of others. So when they became parents, they loved through actions more than words. They showed up, they worked hard, they fixed what needed fixing. But they didn't always say, "I'm proud of you." They assumed you knew. To some children, that silence created doubt. To others, it created resilience. Because love was anti-performative, it was practical. And in their world, providing stability was the loudest form of affection, even if it sounded quiet. For many children of Generation X parents, understanding doesn't come early. It comes later, sometimes much later. As adults, they begin to notice something. They realize they don't panic easily. They solve problems without immediately seeking rescue. They tolerate discomfort better than they thought. And slowly, they connect the dots. The space that once felt like distance starts to look like trust. The silence that once felt cold starts to look like restraint. The independence that once felt forced starts to look like preparation. They begin to see that their parents weren't emotionally absent. They were emotionally contained. Not because they didn't care, but because that was the language they were taught. And when that realization arrives, something softens. Not just toward their parents, but toward themselves. As time passes, many children of Generation X parents begin to notice something subtle. They start parenting in ways that feel familiar. They give space, they expect resilience. They don't rush to fix every discomfort. And sometimes they hear their own voice sounding like their parents, not in tone, but in intention. That realization can be surprising, because for years they believed they would do things differently, more openly, more emotionally, more verbally. And often they do. But they also carry something inherited, a calm under pressure, a quiet steadiness, an instinct not to overreact. They begin to understand that emotional restraint isn't the absence of love, it's a different expression of it. And in that understanding, something shifts. Not blame, not regret, but perspective. Generation X parents may not have expressed love the way we see it today. They didn't always say the words. They didn't always explain the reasons, but they showed up. They endured. They provided stability in ways that felt ordinary at the time. And sometimes what feels ordinary in childhood becomes extraordinary in hindsight. Not every silence meant distance. Not every restraint meant coldness. Sometimes it meant trust. Sometimes it meant strength. And sometimes it meant love expressed through steadiness rather than softness. Understanding that doesn't rewrite the past, but it can soften how we remember it. If this reflection resonated with you, consider subscribing to the channel. We explore the psychology behind behavior, generational patterns, and emotional dynamics. Watch our next video and explore the others on the channel, because understanding the past often changes how we move forward.